Okay. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We're excited you're joining us tonight to hear more about our fiscal year 22 budget priorities and engagement findings, as well as next steps. My name is Shanita Burney, and I'm the Communications and Engagement Officer for DCPS, and happy to be here with you today. So before I turn it over to my colleague for some housekeeping, I wanted to mention what we will cover this evening. So you'll see the agenda here. We'll start with a welcome and overview of the budget model shift. We'll spend some time sharing with you what we heard over the summer through our public engagement that we did, and then ultimately what our response, how we are responding to that feedback, and our next steps associated with our new budget model. Uh, there will be an opportunity for questions, and so we'll have some of that space at the end as well. As we go to the next slide, I'm going to ask my colleague Jerry to explain how the subtitles work in this presentation for those who can benefit from that today.
Thank you, Shanita. My name is Jerry Ular, the Public Events and Engagement Coordinator for the Communications and Engagement team. And so just wanted to get everyone centered around how to use subtitles, or if you need ASL or Spanish interpretation, we do have that available for you to participate. So to participate using subtitles, we have them available in Spanish, French, Vietnamese, Chinese, and I think I listed them all. But if you go to the gear button in the bottom right, go ahead, press on the gear, press captions and subtitles, and then that's where you can find the additional languages that you need subtitles for, as well as English. If you need ASL or Spanish interpretation, that should be shared in the chat box in the bottom right as well. And so we do have DCPS staff members on both the Spanish and ASL interpretation to help out with any of the interpretations that you may have throughout this presentation. And then for using the chat function or the Q&A function, in the bottom right, you'll see different announcements from DCPS staff. And then we also have a group of us trying to answer as many questions as possible. And so you go ahead, use the Q&A function to ask questions, share insights, share comments that you may have throughout the entire process. And we will make sure to try to answer as many questions that we're able to for this presentation. And you can also participate anonymously. We do encourage you to share your name if you do want a response throughout the entire process by the end of this week. And so if you're looking for a question or a comment, please share your email if you are expecting a response as soon as we can provide it. And then for the community agreement, we're asking that everyone participate, including ourselves, on DCPS Central Office, to assume best intentions, to go hard on ideas and not on people, and then also to accept non-closure. We know with the budget process, it can be hard to talk about and also to figure out like what needs to be shared. And so we want to make sure that everyone feels welcomed into this discussion and this dialogue. From there, I'm going to turn it over to Shanita.
Great. Thanks so much, Jerry. Before I welcome the Chancellor, I want to stress one thing around how we will manage the chat around in the Q&A. We anticipate quite a few questions and comments will come in. And there's a team of my staff and budget staff members who will do their best to answer and address as many of the comments as we can. But we know we won't get to everything. And so we'll also take quite a few questions live tonight as well. Please, we ask you to be patient with us and understand we'll do our best to get to as many as the questions as possible. With that, I want to introduce the Chancellor to welcome us here tonight and give some opening remarks. Chancellor Ferebee.
Thank you, Ms. Burney. I appreciate that introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us for this important conversation this evening. It's important to note that our shift to our new budget model is grounded in your feedback. We've heard from the DCPS community that there's 3 points of consideration that we should be thinking about as we go forward in a new budget model. From the outset of this effort, we focused on 3 priorities that represent the feedback that you provided to us, and that is, there's a need for greater equity, sustainability, and transparency as we think about the development and the allocation of resources associated with the DCPS budget model. We started by conducting a financial and resource study on our resources. We were fortunate to have support from the Ed Fund to secure a third-party review of the district's budget allocation model. These findings from this financial review we'll share more about this evening, but are the foundation for how we'll be thinking about the 3 areas that you helped us identify as need, and that is equity, sustainability, and transparency. Based on your feedback, again, we know that our model should address our strengths and also our challenges, which include continue to provide equity across all schools, acknowledging that there's various needs from school to school and classroom to classroom. Significantly improve transparency so stakeholders can see and understand both what and why they're getting certain dollars or resources, and also providing principals with the kinds of flexibility that are critical for decisions impacting teaching and learning, and their ability to take the local context of their school communities and make the best decisions as relates to supports and resources. So again, equity, sustainability, and transparency are top of mind as we go forward. As you look at the next slide on the screen, you can see some of our bright spots and opportunities that I mentioned earlier. We know that DCPS invests more in students compared to many other similar large urban school districts. We also know that we've seen tremendous progress in our assessment data, and we've outpaced many of our other urban districts, specifically on the National Assessment for Educational Progress. DCPS also continues to prioritize spending in schools to ensure that students who may be impacted by poverty, for example, are receiving additional resources. However, we know, again, some challenges exist, and there's some opportunity for improvement. We know the per student spending varies across school, and we must adjust for the various needs of students. And also we know that there's some inequities specifically pronounced at the secondary level. We also know and acknowledge that DCPS has a significant number of smaller schools, and smaller schools require additional spending to maintain the appropriate student experience. We know we have an opportunity to create a model that increases equity, but also maintaining financial stability. And financial stability is important because we need a model that we can implement with great consistency over a period of time with the resources that would be allocated to DCPS. As we go forward and thinking about ways in which we would build this next generation budget model for DCPS, it's been a very iterative process. This work has been informed by multiple stakeholders, our principals. We even had a policy task force to assist us. We know that our success hinges on the degree in which we have authentic engagement with a diverse set of stakeholders and perspectives. I also want to note that these intentional structures, such as our budget task force of principals and our policy task force, provided great feedback. However, we know we need to continue to take into account your voices, and then throughout the year, we've discussed with many stakeholders, including parent groups and advisory board, how we might go forward in this next generation budget model. We wanted to have more engagement, and we planned to go even deeper. However, I do want to acknowledge that the pandemic has compromised a bit our ability to have the level of outreach that we'd like to have and the type of net we wanted to cast. However, though, we believe we have feedback that captures the perspectives of our stakeholders and is very diverse in perspective. We also want to ensure that we continue to keep you informed as we move towards a new budget model and help many understand not only the budget model, but how we created a path forward to go deeper with our school communities over the next couple months, include additional principal engagement and also our online public engagement that we've already had. I also want you to know that we've heard you loudly and clearly, that equitable and transparent allocation of resources is a priority, and that we will continue working towards this goal and remain focused on closing opportunity gaps to ensure that all students across all 8 wards are experiencing success. So, to learn more about what you share with us and the feedback we receive, our Resource Strategy Officer, Sharon Gaskins, will walk you through the next steps of our engagement and share some of the data points with you and the way that we're thinking about these data points as it relates to our new budget model. It is my pleasure to turn it over now at this time to our Resource Strategy Officer, Sharon Gaskins.
Thank you, Chancellor, and good evening, everyone. I'm excited to present the results of our public input survey. What you're seeing here is a snapshot of the landing page from our survey. And so as the Chancellor mentioned, I'll take a moment to walk through what our engagement looked like and the feedback we received. So first, some quick statistics about the survey. The public input website was opened from August the 8th through September the 4th. In addition to videos on our process for developing the next generation budget model, the survey included 6 content-specific questions and 1 open-ended question for final comments or questions. And as you can see from this slide, the survey received over 3,000 views. And our budget staff and our community engagement staff read through all 499 comments received. We received a mix of parent, community member, staff, and student responses, and we're really happy to see that all of our wards were represented. And while we appreciated receiving such a large volume of thoughtful and comprehensive comments and feedback, today we won't be able to address all of them, but instead we'll look at 4 central themes from that feedback. The first is the purpose or the why of the new funding model, transparency, how the model allocations will address existing needs, and finally the impact of the new model on our schools. So in the next several slides, I'll walk through these themes. For our first theme, understanding why we're making this shift, many respondents wanted to better understand the specific problems we were trying to solve with the new budget model. Are we addressing the issue of inequities across schools or students? Are we aiming to simplify the process, or are we hoping to make the budget process more accessible to the public? And closely connected to those questions, there was also an interest in how we're defining and measuring the success of our new model. What priorities do we have, and how will we know if we've achieved our goals? We heard an overwhelming desire for increased transparency in 2 ways. One area related to our budgeting process and how we receive our funds. Several individuals had questions about how the money flows through the system to DCPS, how decisions are made about allocating funds between central office and schools, and how things like facilities are funded. Another area around transparency related to the way school budgets are developed and how those budgetary decisions are made at the school level. We also received a high level of feedback about how each funding model would work. Respondents sought to better understand the differences between the models and really expressed a desire for us here at DCPS to better communicate the differences, particularly between the staffing model and how that compares to a student-based budgeting model. However, there was consensus across the majority of respondents that resources should go to students who need them the most, and that dollars should follow those needs. When asked about key programs or staffing that our respondents deemed most essential, we heard a variety of individual and community priorities. Respondents ranged from music to arts to community service and many other areas. And really, the diversity of these priorities across respondents is really not surprising, and it aligns with a central belief that we hold, is that no two schools are the same, and that school leaders and school communities need to be at the center of making the best resource decisions for their students. And finally, we received questions about how the model change would impact specific schools, especially small schools. There were concerns about the impact that a student-based funding model would have on such schools, and whether small schools would be sustainable if all dollars followed the students, and what would be the remaining impact of the students who are remaining in that small school. Okay, so I've shared a lot about the kind of the themes we've culled from the survey, so we'll pause a moment for feedback. And I just want to share a few as thought starters as you enter any reflections in the chat. Were there any key takeaways that you've just heard that you'd like to underscore, what might be missing from what we shared, and are there any surprises? So I will stop talking for a moment and hold for questions.
Thanks, Sharon. I know that there are a number of questions that folks have raised in the chat and that are getting answered there. Let's see. Can we have you answer, Sharon, why aren't you talking about closing achievement gaps and improving student outcomes?
That's a great question. Thank you for whoever raised it. So just as a foundational statement, we're really committed to continuing to strive towards our capital commitment goals. Those goals are focused on promoting equity across our system, excellence goals, and educating the whole child. And we see budget redesign as a key lever for realizing these goals. Without an equitable system of school funding and thoughtful ways of investing funds, it's unlikely we're going to receive the really accelerated outcomes we need for our students. So I can make it clear by saying this. An equitable, transparent, and sustainable funding formula and funding structure, we believe strongly will help us close that achievement gap, because we'll believe it's our way of giving every student and every school what they need to be successful. So thank you for the question.
Thanks, Sharon. Another question that's coming up, will you show us specific examples of how the new budget model will affect individual schools?
Yes, good question. So we will be modeling the impact of our model using current data from our current fiscal year, but there's a real limitation into that, because when the model is fully defined, we'll need two key pieces of data that aren't available. The first is projected enrollment for each school, in addition to our overall funding level for the upcoming fiscal year. Those two pieces of data are critical for us understanding how the impact of the new model will play out with our schools. So as we move through the fall and finalizing our model, we'll be taking those data and doing just that, using them to understand school level impact.
Great, thank you, Sharon. I have a couple more questions I want to lift up. The next question, how will school budgets be calculated for a no harm approach, given decreased enrollments due to COVID and increased technology issues across the city?
So if I'm understanding the question, it's basically how will we hold schools harmless in this shift? Okay, excellent question, thank you. So right now, DCPS, our schools are subject to a stabilization policy, which ensures that no school experiences a year-over-year decrease of more than 5% in its budget. So that's the current policy, and that policy would remain in whatever model we develop for the upcoming fiscal year. In addition, and as I'll share with everybody as we talk about how we're responding to the feedback we've received, we heard loud and clear that there's a need for a deliberate safety net for schools, one to ensure that no matter what happens with their student enrollment, that they're able to provide a foundational baseline level of quality education for every student in the school. And so that safety net concept that we heard loud and clear from the feedback will be something that we would really want to make sure is embedded in the upcoming model.
Great, thanks, Sharon. One more question before we shift to our response, you sharing more about our response to this feedback. We in the community have no idea how money is spent, and a new budget model won't help with that. How can I find out what my school spends money on?
Yes, so a few places, and I will say that this is one area we are really, we've heard really helpful and specific feedback about where more information would be helpful for school leaders, for school communities, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But right now, OSSI, the Office of the State Superintendent, has a website, a DC school report card website, which basically provides school spending for all local education agencies in DC. And so DCPS is included in there. And it is open to the public, and we encourage people to take a look and understanding what that per pupil spending looks like. And it's from it's again for all of the district. And so this is a great thing to reflect on just in terms of what we're working on internally. Many of you are familiar with our DCPS data center website, which we have continued to build and iterate on over the last several years. In the upcoming fiscal year, we're going to really work to build out, we're actually building a new website that will provide much more detail about the district's budget. We're going to be much more transparent with schools, Lsats, community members about the fundamentals of budget development, about whatever formulas that are underneath the model, how they work, and really aiming to ensure that there's a shared understanding across DC with how budgets work. So we are really committed to that work, and are hoping that it will fill that really important need.
Great. So Sharon, I think we can pick back up on the presentation. There'll be additional time at the end for more questions, and folks should still continue to post them in the chat, and we will get to those as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, great. So again, lots of feedback. And let me talk through about how we're responding. So first, on the theme of why are we doing this? Many of you asked, again, why is this shift being made? How will we know if we're successful? What is the goal of this pretty major shift? And I should say, and the Chancellor mentioned this at the beginning of our time together, we recognize that COVID has changed a lot in our worlds, but I do want to really reiterate that our priorities remain the same, our values remain the same. We continue to focus on building a system that is equitable, financially sustainable, and transparent. And with these goals in mind, I'll just share some examples of how we might measure our success underneath them. Okay, So with that bedrock goal of equity, a new system could aim to allocate the majority of dollars via individual student needs, right? So that would mean that based on what a student brings to the school, are they considered an at-risk student? Do they have a disability that needs extra support? A new system could allocate funds based on those student needs. In terms of sustainability, a new system could make sure that we have a baseline of funding for all schools, so that no matter the ebbs and flows of enrollment, that schools have what they need to provide a quality education for the students there. And then finally, transparency. I actually already mentioned a few of these, but we just work very hard to make sure financial information is online, it's easily accessible, and available to the public. In terms of transparency, I won't keep repeating myself. I think I've said it a few times, but again, we're really excited to have a new website that will provide much more information in an easily accessible format. And I mentioned earlier about the budget guidance, and here's just a quick overview of the elements we will be developing out as part of that budget guidance. Now, moving on to what we heard about the different funding models that were outlined in the survey. So one model was the pure staffing model, where staff are allocated to schools based on specific ratios and formulas. Student-based budgeting is when the dollars follow the child. And then the idea of a combination model that takes a little bit of both of those approaches and combines them into one funding model. The majority of responses we received, a total of 61%, supported a combination model. Because we saw this preference come out really clearly in your responses, we wanted to just pause and share a little bit more framing about how such a model could work. So, first, in a combination model, key staff and positions and even programs could continue to be allocated via ratios and by school to ensure that all schools have a sufficient baseline to support all students. This is very similar to what is currently operating in our schools with our comprehensive staffing model. That is the one portion of a combination model. And then the second is those allocations by student, and the icon of the backpack kind of represents the funding that a child might take with him or her as they go to their school. Those funds would follow student need and allocate specific additional dollars for different needs. Again, as I mentioned earlier, if a student is deemed at risk, if a student is an English learner, or if the student is in need of supports because they have a disability. Those funds would increase each school's ability to tailor their programs and their budget to the needs of their unique student body. And as it relates to small schools in particular, this combination model would aim to distribute funds as both a per student portion, and also the staffing portion would help ensure that there's adequate small school funding simultaneously. And across a lot of what we heard, I'll just share some key takeaways and considerations that we heard that we are considering as we move forward to develop the new budget model. Again, we heard a strong need for student need to drive funding and for allocations to be determined by student need. Secondly, we heard a need to ensure that key programs and staffing are dedicated to ensure a strong baseline exists across all schools. Third, we heard a need for flexibility at the school level and real guidance for principals about how to use those flexibilities in a strategic manner. And last, we heard a real need to make sure that kind of no school is left behind, that every school has the resources they need to provide strong general education services, regardless of size. Okay. And finally, there were several questions about the impact of the new budget model on individual schools. What does it mean for my child's school? What does it mean for my neighborhood moving forward? And again, as I mentioned earlier, we aren't able to project out to fiscal year 22 at this time, but we do know that no matter where the funding picture lands for DCPS, we know that any model that allocates more resources to students directly and based on their needs will result in schools with high levels of those students, against high levels of students who are deemed at risk, students who are English learners. Any schools with high levels of these students would receive more funding to meet their needs. And that we know for all schools, another very clear policy that won't be moving is our stabilization policy that will ensure, again, that schools with declining enrollment will be protected from major budget decreases. So zooming out a bit, I'll share a bit about our upcoming timeline of where we are and our next steps. So where we are is right on the left there. We're engaging and sharing. We've been engaging through the use of the survey and sharing our feedback. Over the next several months this fall, we will continue to use this feedback to finalize budget decisions, sharing information with both our public stakeholders and our principals and other school leaders as the model is finalized. And we'll be doing that through the months of September and October. We'll also be launching our new website, leading district-wide convenings such as our convening for Lsats and the public budget hearing, all of which we'll continue to share updates on this topic. And then finally, in December through January, we will dig into budget formulation for school year 21-22. Okay, so with that, I will pause.
Great, thanks so much. So we have a few questions that we want to lift up. The first question I want to raise was placed in the chat box. I thought was important to lift up and answer. And now I can't find it. Okay, I'll come back to that. So a new budget model is beside the point. The real issue is the growth of small schools based on more charter schools and more DCPS specialty schools. So it sounds like that's a comment and a reflection. Is there any feedback or response to how we're thinking about small schools that we want to add there?
Yeah, understood about the push on small schools. Small schools are part of our portfolio of schools in DCPS. In some districts, we know they may choose to close small schools because the economies of scale are hard to manage. In DCPS, we value our small schools. They're part of our portfolio of school choice for families. And so we are committed to making them as robust as possible and would ensure, I mean, if we can't support our schools, then this new model isn't doing its job. So we do have a commitment to making sure in all of the provisions I actually shared earlier about providing a foundational level of funding for all schools, would aim to make sure that those schools can continue, they can continue, to grow as their model allows.
Great, thank you. And the question or the reflection rather that I couldn't find initially. It says the way we're answering the questions seems to imply that DCPS has already made up its mind to change the funding model, regardless of the public comments. I was hoping you could address that.
Well, we're in a space where we've worked for several months to hear from our stakeholders about what's most important. And so I think what you might be hearing from me is a real commitment to our ongoing work to digest that feedback and create a model around it. So I will say that, and hopefully you're hearing this loud and clear, because we've heard it from all of you, equity is critical. And so we are, part of what I'm talking about today is how we can operationalize that. Right? How do we make sure our system is truly carrying out that goal? And so you're seeing a little bit of our thinking of how we're using those considerations to develop our next steps. Our transparency plans will happen regardless of a model. These are things that we've the team's been working on for several months, and so we know that no matter how the formulas and ratios operate, we need to be more transparent about them. And so those are things that are just critical no matter what the technicalities of the model looks like. So you may be hearing that from me as well. And hopefully that makes sense. Just we're iterating as we're learning, and we want to be transparent about how we're learning, how we're using that feedback to continue to develop this new system.
Yeah, I know the Chancellor wanted to chime in here, so I wanted to pivot to him.
Thank you, Ms. Burney. Thank you, Ms. Gaskins, for the opportunity just to add additional context to this question. I think it's an important question for us to answer. And I think what you are hearing tonight is our drive to be responsive to the feedback we receive. We receive tremendous feedback that there's challenges with equity and the various needs across our school, that many people are challenged by the lack of understanding that they have of how schools get certain dollars and why. And we get lots of questions about funding streams that can't be reflected in our current approach of our comprehensive staffing model. And then we also, again, want to create a model that is sustainable. So I just want to reiterate that point that, what you're hearing from us tonight is a model has not been identified, and we haven't landed on what our approach will be for the next generation of allocation of resources to school. But what you are hearing is there is a strong desire to react positively to the questions and the challenges that we've heard from our school communities. And we know that the status quo will be challenging for us if we can't pivot to something that represents a step forward in those three areas that we've talked about a lot tonight in terms of equity, transparency, and sustainability. So I just want to make sure that that was really clear in what's driving the conversation tonight and how we're approaching this work.
Thank you, Chancellor. Thank you, Sharon. I'm going to keep going with questions, a couple more. This is a comment. Central office is overfunded and provides little value. The money used to fund Central should go to schools. So Sharon, I'm not sure if you want to speak to the percentage of our overall budget that goes to Central and how we work to balance that in our overall budget.
Yep, I'm happy to take that question, and I fully understand it. The purpose of central office is to provide quality supports to our schools, and it takes a variety of forms, and many of our centrally budgeted services are actually activities that happen within schools. And so when a member of the public might just look at central office's portion of DCPS's budget. You might think, oh my gosh, what are all these people doing? And in fact, a lot of those people are doing work in schools. Just some examples are related service providers who provide services to students with disabilities, including like occupational therapy, speech therapy, services like that. A lot of those funds sit on central office's budget, and those folks are serving students in schools over the course of the year. Food services is another example of services that sit on central office's budget but go directly to our schools. And then there are also these like core critical functions that we know allow any system to operate well. Our human resources function, procurement, which allow us to access goods and services for schools and students, operations, things that keeping really the work of schools moving smoothly to our best of our ability. All of these sit on central office budget. So know that we take that work very seriously and really do our best to make sure that we are very good stewards and ensuring that the services that our schools receive are the best quality we can provide. So hopefully that's a little bit more background, and I think that's something, that question which we do get from time to time, as part of what we need to share better on in our transparency efforts. So that kind of information is accessible to everybody, and so that's part of what we want to do better moving forward, is to make those distinctions even clearer.
Great, thanks, Sharon. We're just going to keep taking questions. The next question: are we going to learn the answers to the questions and concerns people shared in the survey?
So the answers to the questions and concerns. Sorry. I will take how I think I'll interpret that, but if not, let me know. So one thing about the survey that everybody may or may not know in terms of the questions that people raised and the feedback that people raised, it's all open for public view. So and us trying to pull together these broad themes, you could feel free to see all the underlying data that led us to pull those themes together. And it's, again, 499 comments, but it's really helpful for us to be able to not only see those responses, but share them to the broader community as we work through these new developments together. I think the questions might be, the question that was raised may relate directly to the chat. If that's the case, I know that there's some questions and responses being provided as quickly as we can to those who raise the questions. And if you're able to tag your name or label who you are, if we're not able to get back to you today, we'll do so as soon as we can. That's if there's another dimension to the question that I'm missing, feel free to just let me know.
Yeah, the way I interpreted it was the survey that we posted on public input. As you mentioned, the feedback there is available for anybody to see, but it's probably easiest to be able to share in some way that feedback, to synthesize that information and to share it back with folks. So we can post that feedback on the DCPS website.
Sure. Yep, that's helpful. Thank you, Shanita.
Another question: how is this different from the weighted student formula that we used in the past?
Yep, helpful question. So I will talk about, I'll use that question and just try to situate it into the presentation I just walked through. So when we've been talking about student-based budgeting, the little icon of the backpack, that backpack represents what could be considered a student weight. So a student who has one category of need. Again, like a student who needs extra support because they have a disability, their backpack might be a little bigger, and that means their enrollment is weighted to provide them a little bit more support. If that student's also an English learner and needs additional supports in that front, their backpack would be a little bigger. And functionally speaking, that would be another weight to their funding as they enter their school. And so when we talk about student-based budgeting, it's actually that weight is part of it, because who you are as a student determines the weight you bring in terms of that funding that follows you. So as we've been talking about a combination model, the model that about 60% of our respondents chose as being the one they'd want to see in DC would be a mix of that weighted funding model and the staffing model, similar to our current CSM. So there are similar terms that that are similarly aligned. Hopefully that's helpful.
Great, thank you, Sharon. Next question, what technical assistance will be provided to Lsats and communities to understand any changes to how we budget?
Yes, so I'll speak a bit, and if anybody from our engagement team wants to speak up as well on the Lsat front, we will plan to share updated information and materials during our fall Lsat convenings. We will aim to provide as much of updated information about the underlying formulas for staffing, background on the guidance that we're providing principals, so our Lsats have access to the information they need to be, continue to be thoughtful partners to each school. I will say that if members of the Lsats are on this call, please continue to engage with us, because part of what makes us iterate in a really productive way is continuing having that feedback loop with all of you. I'll pause here to see if I've missed anything from our engagement team.
Yeah, I know Eli Hoffman is on the line and was going to chime in with some additional information.
Great.
Hey everyone, sorry, I kind of missed half of that. I was trying to answer another question in the chat here, but adding on a little bit to what Sharon mentioned, we'll continue to have those webinars that we have throughout the budget season. So those normally start in late October or November and kind of go all the way through budget season there. So we talk about how we make our enrollment projections, as well as a little bit more, and there'll obviously be more in-depth information this year about how our FY22 budgets are formed, how schools receive their funding, and those types of things. And we also normally offer in-person, or likely in this case, virtual roundtables specific for Lsats, beyond just those webinars, for folks to kind of come together, get their questions answered from specific content teams at DCPS. So for instance, our special education folks are normally there. Specials like music, those kind of people kind of come and get answers, give answers to local school advisory folks. We'll make sure we have those, whether that's an actual roundtable or in the form of office hours. We'll make sure that Lsats have that opportunity again this year.
Thanks, Eli. There's a question I'd love for the Chancellor to chime in on. Is there a willingness to update DCPS's definition of equity to include racial equity? It seems like explicitly naming that is needed in light of the unequal impacts of COVID on Black and Latinx communities and the ongoing uprisings around police brutality and other injustices.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Burney, for raising up that question. We definitely appreciate the push at this moment as the call for racial justice and work and movement on racial equity is more pronounced, as it should be. And it's definitely something that DCPS is focused on. So we we'll definitely take that in consideration of putting more definition around, our position as it relates to racial equity. However, we do need to acknowledge that equity, can come in other forms in terms of our work. And we think about proportionality and representation as it relates to not only race, but also class, gender, and other areas. So those are all that we embrace as responsibilities and actions that we should take. So we'll continue to lift up what that means as it relates to racial equity, and we appreciate you calling on us to put more definition and context on our stance on that particular topic.
Great, thank you, Chancellor. Let's see. Are there more questions that we have? While we, I'm not sure if we have more questions, but I'll go ahead and share some of our next steps. We can go to the next slide. We, of course, want to highlight the LSAT guidance and toolkit, the bit.ly link there where you can access our most updated materials as you prepare for these LSAT questions. For additional questions that you have that come up either after this discussion or that didn't get answered in the chat or by us, feel free to email dcps.schoolfunding@k12.dc.gov. We'll also share this slide deck with you so you have this information to reference. And of course, visit dcpsreopenstrong.com. We'll have additional resources there, but as well on our DCPS website by going to dcps.dc.gov/budget. You can receive and see all of our most updated information there as well. Excellent. So there's one additional question that's come through for me. Will the DCPS Interactive Data Budget website, that's the one that folks will know as dcpsdatacenter.com, be updated to reflect this new model, or will a completely new website be created to house this information? Great question.
Yes, that is a great question. So we are keeping we are not sunsetting completely the DCPS data center. All the data and historical information that is housed there, we will keep there. But we are building out a more robust website that speaks to some of the content I shared earlier. So one isn't going away. We're just building a much broader and much more robust website. So we're able to kind of expand upon the level of information we've been providing. So we'll have everything and more moving forward.
Fantastic. Excellent. So great. So we are gonna come to a close. And thank everybody for joining us, of course. We will be following up with a recording of this meeting, and we typically post that on our DCPS YouTube channel, as well as on our various websites that you can access. You'll, in that recording, see a copy of this deck and the questions here that we answered in the chat. Again, if you have additional questions, feel free to email us at dcps.schoolfunding@k12.dc.gov. It's a long email address. I recognize that. It'll be in the deck when you receive it. And of course, continue to let us know if you have any questions from Lsats and need assistance. You can always email us at ceo.info@k12.dc.gov. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We look forward to continuing to share more information and more opportunities to weigh in around how this is rolling out in the coming weeks and months. Thanks, everybody, and have a wonderful